She begged the Duke to stay away, until he saw her bruises and destroyed every rule to protect her. The glove slipped. That was all it took. One small, careless moment in the middle of a crowded drawing room, and Celeste felt the fabric slide just far enough down her wrist that she had to grab it with her other hand and pull it back up before anyone noticed. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She did not look around. She did not check if anyone had seen. She simply fixed her glove, straightened her posture, and smiled at the woman in front of her as if nothing had happened at all. That was how Celeste Harrow moved through the world. Carefully. Quietly. Always 1 second ahead of anything that might expose her. She was 23 years old, and she was very, very good at pretending. The evening was being held at Dunmore Hall, one of the grandest estates in the county, owned by Lord and Lady Forsyth, who threw parties the way other people breathed, constantly and without much thought. The rooms were full of candlelight and conversation, the kind of warm, golden atmosphere that made everyone look healthier and happier than they actually were. Celeste had been here before. She knew which corner of the east parlor had the best sightline to the door. She knew how to stand close enough to a group to appear engaged without being close enough to be pulled into a real conversation. She had learned all of this in 2 years of marriage to Edmund Harrow, who was currently on the other side of the room laughing at something another gentleman had said, his dark hair perfectly combed, his smile perfectly placed. Edmund was good at smiling. It was the thing people noticed about him first. He had a warm, easy smile that made strangers feel immediately comfortable, the kind of smile that made people say things like, "What a charming man," and "Celeste is so lucky." She used to think that too, once, a long time ago, before she understood that the smile was something he wore, the way she wore her long gloves. She kept her distance from him tonight. That was the arrangement they had reached without ever speaking it aloud. At public events, they were affectionate and pleasant. They arrived together and left together. In between, they existed in separate orbits, which suited Celeste perfectly, because the further away Edmund was, the easier it was to breathe. She was reaching for a glass of water from a passing tray when she became aware of someone entering the room. She did not know why she noticed him. The room was full of people arriving and departing all evening. But there was something about the way this man walked that made the air around him feel different. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than most of the men present, and he moved without any of the performative ease that characterized so many of the guests at events like this. He did not pause at the doorway to let people notice him. He did not scan the room looking for familiar faces to greet. He simply walked in, and his eyes went slowly, carefully around the space, the way someone checks a room they are not entirely sure they want to be in. He looked as if he would rather be somewhere else entirely. And somehow that made him the most interesting person in the room. Celeste watched him for a moment longer than she should have. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with a face that was more serious than handsome, though it was that too. Dark brows, a jaw that looked like it hadn't made peace with anything in a while, and eyes that were a shade of grey she could not quite name from across the room. He was speaking now to Lord Forsyth, who was greeting him with the particular energy of a man welcoming someone important. "That is Callum Ashford," said a voice beside her. Celeste turned. It was her acquaintance Clara Neville, a cheerful, well-meaning woman who knew everything about everyone and was generous enough to share it freely. "The Duke of Renmore," Clara continued, lowering her voice to the pleasant pitch of someone sharing interesting information rather than gossip. "He has been away for nearly 3 years managing his northern estates. Rather reclusive, from what I understand. Not much for society. His mother is beside herself trying to get him to attend things. I am surprised he came tonight, honestly." "He looks it," Celeste said, before she could stop herself. Clara laughed softly. "He does rather, doesn't he? But he is a good man, by all accounts. Serious. Very private. Not the sort who is charming in the way your husband is charming." She paused, and Celeste had the slight delicacy in that pause, the careful way Clara had worded it. More the sort who means what he says and says very little. Celeste looked away from the Duke and back at her water glass. "Interesting," she said, and made her voice entirely neutral. But the evening shifted after that, in a small way she could not entirely explain. She was standing near the window later, watching the garden outside where the lanterns were lit along the path, when she heard footsteps approach and stop a few feet away. She thought it was Edmund at first, and her whole body tensed before she turned. It was the Duke. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the garden too, standing beside her with the relaxed but contained posture of a man who had learned to take up space without demanding attention. Up close he was even more noticeably quiet than he had appeared from across the room. Not cold, exactly. Just still, in the way that very few people ever manage to be. "The light is better over here," he said after a moment. Celeste blinked. "I beg your pardon." "On that side of the room," he said, nodding back toward the crowd, "there are about 14 candles burning too close together. It makes everything feel slightly suffocating after a while. The window helps." She looked at him. He was still watching the garden. "Yes," she said carefully. "It does." That was the beginning and the end of it. He stood there for another minute, comfortable in the silence in a way that surprised her, and then he excused himself with a small nod and walked away. Celeste stood very still. She did not know what had just happened. It had been nothing. A few words about candles. And yet something about those few minutes had left a strange feeling in her chest, the way a window left open in an empty house lets in a sound you cannot quite identify. Edmund found her 20 minutes later. He took her arm with a firm, familiar grip that looked like affection to anyone watching and felt like a reminder to her. "Time to go," he said pleasantly. She went. In the carriage, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the dark road pass outside the window. Edmund talked for a while about the evening, about a business contact he had spoken to, about the quality of the wine. She responded at the right moments. She had become very skilled at the shape of a conversation without being fully present inside it. She did not think about the Duke again. She told herself she did not think about him again. But when she lay awake later that night in the silence of the room, she found herself remembering what Clara had said. More the sort who means what he says and says very little. And she thought, without meaning to, that there was something almost unbearably rare about that. 3 weeks passed before she saw him again. There was a luncheon at the Alderton house on a bright Wednesday, the kind of midday gathering where the food was secondary to the talking and the talking was secondary to being seen. Celeste had not wanted to come. She had woken that morning with a heaviness in her that made every small task feel enormous, but Edmund had already told people they would be there, and so she put on her cream-colored dress with the long sleeves and she came. The Alderton house was comfortable and well lit and Celeste positioned herself near the windows again, out of old habit. She had done it so many times now that she did not even notice she was doing it. Windows meant the fastest exit. Windows meant no one could stand behind her. She saw the Duke across the garden about an hour into the luncheon. He was standing with a small group but not participating much in whatever the conversation was. He had a glass in his hand and the look of a man who was fulfilling an obligation with dignity but no enthusiasm. She might have smiled at that, just slightly, if smiling had felt like something she could afford. He noticed her a few minutes later. Their eyes met the way they had at Dunmore Hall, briefly and with the same strange quality of recognition, as if they had already decided something about each other without ever discussing it. He gave a small nod. She returned it. That should have been the end of it. Except that Edmund was pulled aside by his host halfway through the afternoon, something about a piece of business that needed a private word, and suddenly Celeste found herself standing alone for the first time in what felt like weeks. She breathed. Just that. She breathed slowly and let her shoulders settle and stood in the garden sunlight and simply existed for a moment without performing. "You look different," said a voice, and she turned to find the Duke standing a few feet away, not quite beside her, giving her enough space that it felt like a choice rather than an intrusion. She straightened immediately. "I beg your pardon." "Not different from before," he said, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to be accurate. "Different from a moment ago. When no one was watching." Celeste felt the blood leave her face. She kept her expression completely still. "I do not know what you mean," she said. "All right," he said simply. He did not push. He did not explain himself further or try to make her acknowledge what they both understood. He just stood there with his glass and looked out at the garden, and after a moment said, "My name is Callum. I do not think we were formally introduced." She stared at him for a long second. "Celeste," she said. "I know," he said. "I asked." She should have ended the conversation there. She should have excused herself and moved toward another group and put distance between herself and a man who noticed things she could not afford to have noticed. Every careful instinct she had developed over 2 years told her to walk away. Instead, she heard herself say, quietly, "You should not have asked." He turned and looked at her, then, really looked at her, and there was nothing uncomfortable about it, nothing that made her feel examined or exposed. He just looked, the way someone looks at a door that is slightly open when they expected to find it closed. "Probably not," he agreed. And somehow that was worse. Not worse in a frightening way. Worse in the way that honesty is always slightly devastating when you are not used to it. Edmund returned 20 minutes later. Celeste saw him coming from across the garden and felt herself reassemble, piece by careful piece, back into the shape she was supposed to hold. "We should find the others," she said quickly. Callum glanced once in the direction she was looking, and then back at her. "Of course," he said. His voice was entirely neutral. But there was something in the brief pause before he spoke that made her feel certain he had understood everything. She walked away without looking back. Over the next 2 weeks she saw him 3 more times. Once at a dinner, once briefly on the street when their carriages passed and he raised a hand in acknowledgement, and once at a small card evening where they ended up seated at opposite ends of the same table for nearly an hour. Each time she made sure to keep herself composed. Each time she made sure to give nothing away. She was polite and brief and perfectly ordinary in every interaction, the way she was with everyone. But Callum Ashford was paying attention. She did not know this yet. She did not know that he had started to notice the way Edmund Harrow placed his hand on the back of her chair and she went still. She did not know that Callum had begun to track, without meaning to, the small details of her body language that were invisible to people who were not looking for them. The fractional pause before she answered questions. The way her eyes moved to Edmund whenever she was speaking to someone else. The high collars and long sleeves that never changed regardless of the warmth of the day. She did not know any of this. She was simply trying, as she did every single day, to get through the hours without anything going wrong. That was what her life had become. A series of days measured not by what happened in them, but by what did not. She told herself this was enough. She told herself it every morning, and most mornings she believed it. But some nights she lay awake and thought about a man who stood near windows and said very little and noticed everything, and she thought that there had once been a version of herself who might have found that extraordinary. She did not let herself think about what had happened to that version. Not yet. She was not ready for that. Not yet. The morning it happened was a Tuesday, which was a detail Celeste would remember forever afterward, because there had been nothing particular about that Tuesday that should have made it different from any other. It was grey outside. The kind of flat, colorless English morning that doesn't commit to being either bad or fine. She had her list of errands. She had her schedule. She had her composure locked in place the way she always did before she left the house. She had been given 2 days. Edmund was traveling to see a business associate in the next county, leaving early and not returning until Thursday evening. These windows of time were rare enough that Celeste had learned not to waste them. She did not celebrate them, did not allow herself any visible shift in her demeanor, because she was always aware that staff talked and habits were noticed. But inside, in the quiet private room of herself that she kept carefully locked, she breathed differently during those 2 days. She went to the market first. Then to the seamstress on Blythe Street to collect an altered coat. Then, because it was on the way and because she had not allowed herself a new book in 2 months and she wanted one with a fervor that embarrassed her slightly, she stopped at the Lending Library on Carroll Street. She liked the library. It smelled like paper and old wood, and it was the kind of quiet that felt chosen rather than imposed. The woman at the desk knew her by sight and greeted her with a small nod, and Celeste spent 20 comfortable minutes moving through the shelves, pulling out spines and reading the first page of things, putting them back. She chose 3 books in the end. More than she strictly needed, but it was Tuesday and Edmund was not here and she allowed herself the small excess. She was carrying all 3 along with her bag when she came back down the narrow main aisle toward the door. She was thinking about which book to start first. She was not thinking about the slight unevenness of the step at the library entrance, which she knew about and had navigated a dozen times without trouble. This time she caught her toe on it. She went forward sharply, tried to correct, and hit her shoulder hard against the door frame. The books went everywhere. Her back swung out and then back, and in the chaos of catching herself her left arm came up and she braced against the frame, and she felt the glove catch on a nail head in the old wood and slide. She stood there for one frozen second. Then she heard the books being picked up. She turned very slowly. Callum Ashford was crouched on the floor of the library entrance, gathering her books with the quiet efficiency of someone doing a practical thing without any drama around it. He did not look up immediately. He collected all 3 books and her bag strap and then stood, and as he stood he looked at her properly for the first time since the commotion began, and that was when his eyes went to her left arm. She felt it happen. She felt the exact moment his gaze landed and stayed, just a fraction of a second too long, and then moved back to her face. She pulled the glove up. Her hand was shaking. She watched him watch her do this. His expression did not change. This was what she would think about later, again and again, in the weeks that followed. His expression did not change. There was no gasp, no wide eyes, no visible shock, no dramatic pulling back. His face stayed exactly as it always was, that careful, steady stillness that was simply his natural quality, and he held out her books and her bag and he said nothing at all. She took them. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "I am perfectly fine," she said. The words came out very even. She had years of practice at even. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression she had never quite seen on anyone's face before, or perhaps she had not let herself look closely enough at anyone's face in a long time. It was not pity. She would have been able to handle pity, she knew how to deflect it. It was not alarm, which she could have dismissed. It was something quieter and more specific than either of those things. Something that looked almost like grief, except that it was very controlled, very contained, the way you contain something that is not yours to release. "Do not," she said quietly. "Do not what?" "Whatever you are thinking of saying." He was quiet for a moment. "I was not going to say anything," he said. She studied him. "You were." "I was thinking it," he said carefully. "That is not the same thing." She wanted to end the conversation. Her instincts were screaming at her to end it, to thank him for the books and walk out of that door and put space between herself and this moment and never come back to it. She knew how to do that. She had done it so many times, with so many people who had come just slightly too close to the edges of what her life actually looked like. But her hands were still trembling, just slightly, and her shoulder hurt from the door frame, and something about Callum Ashford's face in that moment, that steady, grieving, entirely non-demanding expression, made her throat tighten in a way she had not allowed in a very long time. "It was a nail," she said. Her voice came out barely above a murmur. "In the door frame. It caught." He looked at her. She realized what she had said and what it revealed, and felt something cold move through her chest. "I know," he said again. His voice was very gentle. "The books are fine." She nodded. She pressed her lips together. "I have to go," she said. "Of course." She walked out. She made herself walk, not rush. She kept her posture straight and her pace even, and she turned left down Carroll Street and walked 1 full block before she stopped at a wall and stood with her back against it and just breathed, eyes closed, face turned up toward the flat gray sky. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she straightened, gathered herself, and walked home. She did not cry. She did not allow it. But that evening, sitting alone in the quiet of the house with the first of her 3 library books open in her lap, she found she could not read a single word of it. She just sat there in the lamplight with the book open and her hands folded on its pages and her mind going back, over and over, to a man crouching on a library floor gathering her books without making her feel like something that needed to be rescued. She had spent so long in a life where she was either controlled or ignored that she had forgotten, almost entirely, what it felt like to be simply seen. The feeling was so unfamiliar it frightened her. And yet, she sat there for a long time. She thought about the way his face had looked in that moment, and the fact that he had not said what he was thinking, because he understood that she did not need him to say it. She thought about the fact that he had picked up her books and given them back and stood with her in the silence and let her be whoever she needed to be in that moment without asking anything from her in return. She thought about the fact that he had been in that library at all, on that particular Tuesday morning, on that particular grey unremarkable day, and that the step had caught her foot the way it never had before, and that of all the people in the world who might have been standing there, it was him. She did not believe in signs. She was a practical woman with a practical mind, and she had long since learned not to trust things she could not control. But she sat with the unread book in her hands for a long time, and she thought about it. She thought about it for a long time. The nights Celeste found hardest were not the loud ones. The loud ones had a kind of clarity to them, a terrible simplicity that left no room for confusion. It was the quiet nights that undid her, the nights when everything looked ordinary from the outside and the house was still and Edmund was in his study with his papers and there was no particular reason for the tightness in her chest except that it was always there, always, a permanent resident beneath her ribs that she had simply learned to breathe around. It had been 9 days since the library. She had not seen Callum Ashford in those 9 days, and she had told herself, with great deliberateness, that this was exactly right, that she preferred it, that what had happened on Carroll Street was a small and private moment that had no further consequence and would lead to nothing. She had almost convinced herself of this. On the 10th day, a letter arrived. There was no name on it. The handwriting on the front was plain and careful, and when she opened it, the inside contained a single sentence and an address. If you ever need somewhere to go, this door is open. No questions. No conditions. That was all. She read it twice. Then she folded it very precisely along its original lines and put it at the bottom of the small wooden box in her dressing room where she kept things she was not ready to examine closely. Old letters from her brother Oliver. A pressed flower from her mother's garden. A list she had written once, 2 years ago, in the middle of a night when she had been very certain about something and very terrified of it, a list she had never finished writing and could not throw away. She put the letter with these things and closed the box. She did not take it out again. Not that week. But she knew where it was. Meanwhile, Callum Ashford was doing things that Celeste did not know about, and would not know about for some time. He had not made any impulsive decisions. That was important to understand about him. Callum was not a man who acted on instinct or feeling without first sitting very quietly with the weight of a thing and making sure he understood what it actually required of him. He had spent his life doing this. It was why his estates were well run and his debts were zero and his word was considered reliable by the people who knew him. He thought before he moved. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about what he had seen in the library. He thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean and what he was and was not entitled to do about it. He thought about the law, which in his honest view was not sufficient for situations like this one. He thought about what action looked like in a case where the person most directly affected had not asked for his help and had in fact asked him, twice now, to stay away. He thought about all of it. And then, quietly, without announcing himself, he began. The first thing he did was speak to a man named Gerard Court, a solicitor he had known for 15 years who specialized in property and financial arrangements and who was, more importantly, extremely discreet. Callum outlined, without naming anyone, a hypothetical situation involving certain financial obligations that might be used as leverage in a complicated personal matter. Gerard listened, asked 3 precise questions, and provided a precise answer. Edmund Harrow, it turned out, had a debt. Not a small one. He had borrowed substantially from a private investor 2 years prior to fund a land purchase that had not returned what he expected. The debt had been sold twice since and now sat with a holding company, the kind of arrangement where the actual holder was somewhat obscured. Gerald, with certain connections and a morning's careful work, was able to establish who actually held that debt. It was someone who owed Callum a considerable favor from a business matter 3 years prior. Callum wrote one letter. He was very specific about what he was and was not asking for. He was not asking for the debt to be called in entirely, which would have been visible and dramatic and traceable. He was asking for a quiet renegotiation of terms, a sudden and legitimate tightening of the repayment schedule, something that would require Edmund Harrow's immediate financial attention and pull his focus to a set of pressures that had nothing to do with his household. That letter was sent on a Thursday. On the Friday, Callum wrote a different letter. This one took him considerably longer. It was addressed to a man named Oliver Vane, who was Celeste's older brother and who had, from what Callum had been able to establish through careful and entirely normal social inquiry, been estranged from his sister for approximately 2 years. The reason for this estrangement was not something anyone could state plainly in polite society, but the shape of it was clear enough to someone who was paying attention. Oliver Vane had been gradually pushed out of his sister's life by a husband who preferred his wife to have as few independent connections as possible. Callum's letter to Oliver was brief. He introduced himself formally. He said that he had reason to believe Oliver's sister might benefit from knowing that her brother was thinking of her. He said he was not at liberty to share more than that and did not intend to be dramatic about it, but that if Oliver had been considering reaching out to Celeste, now might be a meaningful time to do so. He sealed that letter and sent it on the Friday afternoon. He then did something that cost him very little practically but quite a lot personally. He went to see Magistrate Arthur Felton, a man he had known since boyhood, the son of his father's oldest friend, a serious and trustworthy man who had spent 30 years doing difficult work with steadiness and integrity. Callum did not describe specifics. He did not accuse. He simply said that there was a situation he was monitoring and that if it ever came to Arthur's attention officially, he hoped it would receive full and prompt consideration. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "I understand," Arthur said. "I thought you would," Callum said. He returned home that evening and sat in his study for a while in the dark, without lighting a lamp, which was something he did sometimes when he was working through something that required more than thought. It required simply being in the discomfort of not knowing what would happen next. He did not know if any of what he had done would amount to anything. He did not know if Celeste would ever use the address he had sent her. He did not know if Oliver Vane would respond to his letter or dismiss it or resent the intrusion. He did not know if the financial pressure on Edmund Harrow would land at the right angle or simply make things harder in ways he had not foreseen. He sat in the dark and held all of that uncertainty. The thing that he was certain about was much smaller and much simpler. He was certain that doing nothing was not something he was able to do. He was certain that he had been given information he could not unknow, and that the information required a response, and that the response needed to be careful and patient and as far outside the reach of anyone's awareness as possible. He was certain that he would not put Celeste in any more danger than she was already in. Everything he did would move so slowly and so quietly that it would look like ordinary life to anyone watching. And he was certain, in the still and honest part of himself that he rarely showed to anyone, that this woman, this careful, controlled, extraordinarily composed woman who had stood in a library doorway with a shaking hand and offered him a lie so perfectly worded it almost sounded like the truth, was someone he would not walk away from. He had not made that decision consciously. It had simply arrived in him, the way certain decisions do, the ones that feel less like choices and more like the recognition of something that was already true. He lit a lamp. He found a sheet of paper and he thought for a long time about what to write, and then he wrote, slowly and plainly, the address and one sentence. He sealed it that night and sent it in the morning. He did not know when he would hear anything. He prepared himself to hear nothing. And then Oliver Vane wrote back. 12 days after Callum's letter. A short, careful reply that asked one question and provided, between its lines, everything Callum needed to know about how much Celeste's brother missed his sister and how long he had been trying to find a reason, or a door, or a moment in which going back felt possible rather than foolish. Callum wrote back the same afternoon. Things, from that point, began to move. The morning Oliver arrived at Harrow House was a morning that looked completely ordinary from the outside. The street was quiet. The weather was cool and dry. Celeste was in the sitting room with a piece of needlework she was not really doing, which was something she had learned to keep nearby because it gave her hands something to do and her eyes somewhere to look during the long unstructured hours of mid-morning. She heard the knock at the front door and did not think much of it. Edmund was in the house, which meant her body was already operating at its baseline level of careful stillness, the permanent internal readiness that she maintained whenever he was nearby. She heard Haynes, the butler, go to the door. She heard a voice in the hallway. She did not recognize the voice immediately because she had not heard it in 2 years, and the mind does a strange thing with sounds it has been denied for long enough. It makes them unfamiliar even when they are beloved. But then the voice said something to Haynes and there was a particular rhythm to it, a particular way the syllables fell that was so specific and so deeply embedded in her memory that she was on her feet before she had decided to stand up. Oliver. She stopped in the sitting room doorway. He was standing in the entrance hall looking exactly like himself, which should not have been surprising and yet was, because in her mind he had become somehow abstract over 2 years of silence, a feeling more than a person, and here he was being entirely, unmistakably a person, taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had just forgotten, with the same dark eyes and the same way of standing that meant he was trying to appear calm while actually being anything but. They looked at each other across the hallway. "I should have come sooner," he said. His voice was rough. "You are here now," she said. That was all. That was the whole of the reunion, those 2 sentences in a hallway, and yet Celeste felt something crack open in her chest like a window she had forgotten was sealed. Edmund came out of his study. What happened in the next hour was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are usually described. There was no shouting. There was no single moment of confrontation that resolved everything cleanly. What there was, instead, was Edmund discovering that his brother-in-law, whom he had spent 2 years systematically making feel unwelcome, had arrived at his house with the quiet authority of a man who had made a decision and was not going to be talked out of it. And Edmund, who was facing a financial renegotiation that had appeared without warning 2 weeks prior and who had been advised by his solicitor that morning that a certain legal matter required his immediate attention, found himself in the unusual position of having multiple pressures arrive at once, from directions he had not anticipated, and with a witness standing in his hallway. Edmund was skilled at many things. He was skilled at managing situations, at controlling environments, at presenting himself well under circumstances that required performance. What he was less skilled at was managing a situation in which he could not identify where the pressure was coming from or how to redirect it. He looked at his wife and he looked at her brother and he made the particular calculation that such men make when they realize the landscape has changed without their permission. He told Haynes to bring tea. It was the most ordinary response possible, and it was also a retreat, and everyone in that hallway knew it, though no one said so. 2 hours later, Oliver and Celeste were in the garden. Edmund had returned to his study, and Haynes had been sent on an errand, and they were alone for the first time in 2 years, sitting on the stone bench near the far wall where the climbing roses were just beginning to come back after winter. Oliver did not ask her directly. He was her older brother and he had known her for 23 years and he understood that she was not ready to be asked directly. So instead he talked. He told her about his life, about the house he was renting in the Midlands now, about his friend Henry's wedding in the spring, about a dog he had recently and somewhat accidentally acquired. He was funny about the dog. She laughed, actually laughed, in a way that surprised her, a real laugh, short and genuine, and then she pressed her hand over her mouth as if surprised to find it there. Oliver watched her do this. "There is a room," he said quietly, when the dog story was finished. "In my house. With a door that locks, which I mention only because I think you might find that relevant." She looked at her hands. "I cannot just leave," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to do anything today. You do not understand what it is like to try to," she stopped. Pressed her lips together. "I am starting to," he said. "I think I was kept from understanding for a long time. I am sorry for that." She looked up at him. "That was not your fault," she said. "No," he agreed. But I am still sorry. They sat in silence for a while. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere over the wall a bird was making a persistent, cheerful noise that seemed completely indifferent to the weight of everything that was happening in its vicinity. Someone contacted you, Celeste said eventually. It was not quite a question. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Someone thought I should know that my sister might need her brother. She thought about this. She thought about a man who stood near windows and said very little and sent one sentence in a sealed letter to an address he had no obligation to send anything to at all. Did they say who they were? She asked. Not in so many words. She nodded once. She thought about the box in her dressing room. The letter at the bottom of it. She did not go anywhere that day. Or the next. She made no sudden movements, because sudden movements in her life had always cost more than they were worth, and she had learned this in ways she was not ready to speak aloud. But something had changed. It had changed in the particular way that things change when enough pressure has been applied from enough directions at once, not violently, not loudly, but with the slow and patient force of water finding its way through stone. Nothing looked different from the outside. And yet something had shifted in the structure of things, the way you can feel a change in the air before the weather turns, before any visible sign of it appears. Edmund left for a meeting in the city 4 days after Oliver's visit. He was irritated in the way he was always irritated when something in his life was not behaving as it should, and he directed that irritation in his usual ways, which Celeste absorbed in her usual ways, and then he left. She stood in the entrance hall for a long moment after his carriage pulled away. Then she went to her dressing room. She opened the box. She took out the letter, unfolded it, and read it again. One sentence. One address. No questions. No conditions. She sat with it for a long time. And then she called for her maid and told her to help her pack 2 cases. Just the essentials. Just what she would need for a week, maybe 2. She kept her voice calm and practical, and the maid, who was young and perceptive and had worked in this house for 8 months and had drawn her own quiet conclusions, did not ask a single question. She simply helped pack. Oliver arrived within the hour. She had sent him a note the day before, just 3 words. I am ready. He pulled up in a hired carriage and came to the door and took the 2 cases and held out his hand, and she took it, and walked out of Harrow House without looking back. She would not say later that it felt triumphant. It did not feel triumphant. It felt like the ending of something very long and very heavy, and the beginning of something she could not yet see the shape of. It felt, if she was being honest, like the first step of a walk she had not yet taken, the kind where you do not know the path and the ground is uncertain and you go forward anyway because the alternative is to stand still forever. She went forward. The carriage pulled away from Harrow House and turned left onto the main road, and Oliver sat beside her with his shoulder pressed against hers, warm and steady and present, and she looked out the window as the familiar street disappeared behind them. She breathed. It was a full breath. A complete one. She could not remember the last time she had done that. The house at the address in the letter was not large. That was the first thing Celeste noticed when Oliver's hired carriage turned down the lane and the building came into view. She had half expected something imposing, the kind of property a duke typically owned as a secondary or tertiary residence, grand and cold and deliberately impressive. This was not that. It was a long, low stone house with white-framed windows and ivy growing in a controlled way up the eastern wall, the kind of house that looked like someone had actually thought about what it would feel like to live in it rather than just to look at it from outside. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Brent, was waiting at the door. She was perhaps 60, with an undemonstrative face and a practical manner, and she greeted Celeste and Oliver with simple efficiency, showed them to their rooms, and told them supper would be at 7. She did not ask any questions. She did not look at Celeste with any particular curiosity or sympathy, which was exactly right, and Celeste thought that whoever had arranged this had understood something important about what a person in her situation actually needed, which was not to be regarded as a problem or a project, but simply to be made comfortable. The room she was given had a window that looked out over the garden and a door that locked from the inside. She locked it that first night. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the lock click and just held that sound for a moment. Then she unpacked one of her cases, the smaller one, and washed her face and went down for supper. Oliver was already at the table. They ate together, the two of them, mostly in comfortable silence with occasional small conversation, and afterward they sat in the main room for a while and Oliver read and she looked at the fire and it was the most ordinary evening she had spent in 2 years, which was extraordinary. She slept. She woke up once in the night, as she often did, her body still operating on its old alert system, still listening for footsteps in the hall. She lay in the dark for a few minutes and then the silence registered, real silence, the kind that meant she was the only person in this corridor, and she turned over and went back to sleep. In the morning she woke to the sound of a blackbird in the garden below her window, which was almost insultingly cheerful, and she lay there and listened to it and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not mind it. Callum arrived on the second afternoon. He came on horseback, which she had not expected. She was in the garden when she heard the sound of hoofs on the lane, and she turned, and there he was dismounting at the gate with the same contained, direct quality he always had, as if arriving at a place he hadn't planned to attend but had concluded was necessary. He had not known she was there. She was sure of that. Or rather, she was sure that his coming had not been about whether she was there or not. He had come to check on the house, perhaps, or to speak to Mrs. Brent, or for some other practical reason that had nothing to do with her specifically. She watched him see her. He stopped. Not for long, just a moment. Then he continued through the gate and crossed the garden toward her. "You came," he said. It was not a question and it was not congratulatory. It was just an observation, stated plainly, the way he said everything. "You said no questions," she replied. "I meant it." She looked at him. He was looking back at her in that way he had, that steady, unhurried attention that she still did not quite know what to do with. "You did all of this," she said. "The pressure on Edmund. Oliver. The address. All of it." He was quiet for a moment. He did not deny it, but he chose his words carefully. "I put some things in motion," he said. "Oliver made his own choice to come. You made your own choice to leave. Those were not mine to make." She shook her head slightly. "You know what I mean?" "Yes," he said. "I do." She looked at him. She had spent 2 years in a life where every action had an agenda behind it, where generosity always came with a price she was expected to pay. She had become expert at identifying the hidden transaction behind every seemingly kind gesture. She looked at this man's face and searched for the transaction. She did not find it. "Why?" she asked. Just the one word. He thought about it for long enough that she knew he was going to be honest rather than fast. "Because I could," he said. "And because doing nothing when you are able to do something is a choice too. And I did not want to make that choice." She breathed. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. She turned away and looked at the garden for a moment. The ivy on the eastern wall. The pale sky above it. The complete, impossible quiet of a place where no one was watching her. "I told you twice to stay away," she said. "You did." She was quiet. Then, very quietly, "I am glad you did not listen." He did not respond immediately. She heard him exhale slowly. "So am I," he said. They stood in the garden for a while. They did not touch. They did not make any promises or declarations or plans. There was too much ahead that was still unknown, too many practical and legal realities that would take months to work through, too much that Celeste needed to do simply for herself. The long and careful work of returning to who she had been before 2 years had pressed her into a smaller and more frightened shape. But they stood in the garden as the afternoon light shifted, and the blackbird came back to its branch and resumed its editorial opinion of the whole situation, and Celeste found that she did not feel the need to feel the quiet. She stood in it. The legal separation took 7 months. It was not simple, and it was not painless, and there were days that were very hard in ways she had not anticipated, the strange grief of dismantling even a life that had caused her harm, the fear that arrived without warning in otherwise ordinary moments, the long slow work of learning to trust her own judgment again when it had been undermined for so long. Oliver stayed nearby through most of it. He rented a property 2 villages over and came for supper twice a week and was generally the steadiest presence she could have asked for. She learned to receive this without deflecting it, which took more effort than it should have but less effort than she expected. Edmund Harrow, facing financial pressure, a magistrate's quiet interest, and the sudden and very public presence of his wife's brother, made the particular calculation of a man who understands that the cost of continuing to fight is higher than he is willing to pay. He did not go quietly in any romantic sense. He complained to his solicitor and argued about terms and made the process as prolonged as he could. But he went. Celeste spent 3 months at the house in the lane before returning to the city. She spent those months working in the garden and reading and writing letters to Oliver and to a few carefully chosen friends and learning to sleep through the night without her body insisting on remaining alert. She saw Callum perhaps once a week, sometimes less. He did not arrive with expectations or with agenda. He arrived the way he always did, steadily and without announcement, and they talked, sometimes briefly and sometimes for a long time, about books and about his estates and about nothing in particular, and she found that she looked forward to it in a way that felt clean and uncomplicated, the way you look forward to reliable things. Once, about 6 weeks in, she said something that surprised both of them. They were walking along the lane outside the house, in the early evening, the light going golden over the field on the left side, and she said, without planning to, I had a version of myself, before. Someone I used to be. I had forgotten what she was like. He walked alongside her for a moment. Do you remember now? He asked. She thought about it. Pieces, she said. More every week. He nodded. Good, he said. Simply, fully. She smiled then. Not the performance of a smile, not the careful, practiced shape she had worn to 100 parties. A real one. Small and private and entirely her own. He saw it. He looked away at the field and she could not see his expression, but she saw something in the line of his shoulders that settled, almost imperceptibly, as if something that had been braced in him for a long time had very quietly released. They walked back to the house as the light faded. She had started wearing short sleeves in the garden by then. Not every day. But some days. The kind of day that felt ordinary and warm and hers, and on those days she wore what she liked, and she stood in the sunlight, and the marks on her arms, which were fading now, fading slowly and gradually into the skin of someone who was beginning to live in her own life again, caught the light and she did not hide them. She did not need to hide them. She was done with hiding. The woman who had stood in a library doorway with a shaking hand and offered a stranger a carefully worded lie had not disappeared. She was still there. But she had changed in the way things change when they survive something, not by becoming unrecognizable, but by becoming more fully and more honestly themselves. She wrote in a letter to Oliver, some months later, that she was surprised to find how much of herself was still present, underneath everything. She had expected to have to build herself from nothing, and instead it had felt more like clearing away what did not belong, and finding what had always been there. She kept the letter from the bottom of the box. Not because she needed it anymore, but because it had been the first door, the first real one, and she wanted to remember what that had felt like. The moment when she had read one sentence from a man who asked nothing of her and understood, somehow, that what she needed was not rescue. What she needed was a door. She had walked through it herself. That, she thought, was the most important part. Callum never asked for anything she was not ready to give. Not that autumn, not the following winter, not in the slow, careful months that followed as she rebuilt herself into the shape of someone who could accept good things without flinching. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they are not performing patience but simply living it, when the waiting is not a sacrifice but a choice that makes sense to them. They walked together in the garden of the stone house one last time before she moved back to the city, on a morning in early spring when the first green things were coming up through the ground and the air had that specific quality of things beginning again. I was afraid of you, she told him. When I first told you to stay away. I know, he said. Not because you frightened me. Because of what it would mean. If you didn't. He looked at her. I understand, he said. She looked out at the garden. At the first green shoots coming through the ground. At the ivy on the eastern wall, which had survived the winter without any help from anyone. I am not afraid anymore, she said. He was very still for a moment. No, he said. I can see that. She turned and looked at him fully, with the kind of look that cost something, the kind she had not given anyone in years, open and direct and decided. I would like for you to keep not staying away, she said. If that is something you want. He looked at her for a long moment. And then something happened to his face that she had never seen there before. Not quite a smile. Something more than a smile. Something that lived underneath, that was too honest and too full to be described as simply happiness, though it was that too. Yes, he said. That is something I want. The blackbird in the garden started up again. Cheerful and loud and entirely without self-consciousness about the significance of the moment. She laughed. The real kind. And the morning opened around them, steady and green and full of beginning, and they walked back toward the house together, side by side, in the comfortable quiet of two people who have finally, after a long and difficult road, arrived somewhere true.